Good to be with you again. Every September 14th, I always look forward to the celebration of the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, a very special day for us in St. Helena's Parish, celebrating the day that St. Helena traditionally found the Holy Cross in which Jesus had died. It always strikes me as we think about the life of St. Helena. She became a Christian in the year 312, only about 5 or 7 years after the last and the greatest of the 10 great persecutions of the church. So it was a tough time. It took courage to become a Christian at that point. And she had, of course, been abandoned by her husband, who wanted to become the next Roman emperor, and he was advised to get rid of her because she was just too ordinary. She wasn't connected to the right families in Rome. And so she was living with her son Constantine, who was in charge of the Roman defenses against the barbarians, living in Trier, Germany. Some years ago on a vacation trip, took to that area, and they took us to places associated with Constantine and his governance of that part of the boundary of the empire, and even mentioned they had discovered some of the ruins in which Helena and Constantine lived. He was very dedicated to his mother and took care of her. And so when she was becoming a Christian, I'm sure she talked with him about her decision because it might have an effect on him. She must have also surely talked about the cross of Jesus, because in the same year, he made his move to become the next Roman emperor. And he claimed to have seen a vision in the heavens, the sign of the cross, and the words, "In hoc signo vinces," by this sign you will conquer. And of course, up to that time, the sign of the cross was a sign of death, defeat, disgrace. Only the worst criminals were put to death on a cross. And certainly no Roman citizen would be crucified. So we know St. Peter was crucified, a Jew, but St. Paul, whose family had somehow acquired Roman citizenship, no, he was spared the cross. He was simply beheaded. And so it's amazing that Constantine saw that vision, and as he went to battle against his rival, Maxentius, he told his soldiers to put the sign of the cross on their shields and on their helmets. And I can only imagine many of them saying, "This is crazy. We're putting the sign of defeat on our helmets and our shields." But indeed, Constantine, with a much smaller group of soldiers, defeated his rival and became the emperor. That was in 312, and in 324 he defeated his other rival who was ruling the eastern part of the empire, and so it was possible for St. Helena to go to the east, to the land where Jesus had lived and died and risen. And she was about 80 by that time, and she sent out her aides to find groups of Christians who might know where it was exactly that Jesus was born and where it was that he suffered and died and was buried and rose again. And so from that time on, the cross, which had been the sign of death, became the sign of life. What had been the sign of defeat became a sign of victory. What had been the sign of disgrace became a sign of glory. It is the sign that marks all of us who belong to Jesus by faith. How often we make the sign of the cross as we begin or end our prayers. How often we make the sign of the cross as we enter the church or during the Mass. For many years, I made my annual priestly retreat down at a Trappist Cistercian monastery in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, Holy Cross Abbey. And I was always impressed as the monks gathered, and they come together some 6 times a day to pray as a community, getting up in the early morning hours at 3 or 4 a.m. for the night prayer, and then again about 7 or so for the morning prayer and Mass, and then the midday prayer, and then the evening or Vesper prayers, and then Compline, the night prayers. And every time they gathered, I was always amazed to see the abbot of the monastery, Robert Barnes. He died a couple of years ago. But when he dipped his hand in the holy water and made the sign of the cross, I always was fascinated how slowly and prayerfully he made that sign of the cross. It was such an eloquent demonstration of faith and prayer. I thought, how easy it is for all of us. We know it's in human nature when we do some things often in life, we can become so casual and thoughtless. We do things and not even think about what we're doing or saying. And that monk always reminded me to take the time to do the sign of the cross prayerfully, thoughtfully. It so beautifully sums up a whole relationship to our God in Jesus Christ, crucified and risen. And all of us, as Jesus says, called to carry the cross with him. Think about what you're doing in prayer. Think about those simple gestures that we so often repeat, especially in the celebration of our Mass. Really think about that sign of the cross each time you make it. The day after Holy Cross is always the Feast of Our Lady of Sorrows, the 15th of September. It's like the custom of the Russian Church, the Russian Orthodox Church. Every time it celebrates the feast of Jesus, the next day is always a feast of Mary. And I've always thought this feast kind of connects us again to the cross of Jesus, that Mary, his mother, was called in such an intimate way to share in his sufferings. I can't imagine what she thought as a young mother, perhaps 14, 15 years of age, bringing her darling little child into the temple with St. Joseph to present him to the Lord, and being told by aged Simeon that this beautiful child of yours is a sign of contradiction. He will be rejected by many, accepted by some, and your own heart a sword of sorrow will pierce. What a heavy message for a young girl, young mother. And yes, she was to know those sorrows. Within a few weeks, she and Joseph had to flee from Bethlehem into Egypt to escape Herod. And even when they were able to come back to Nazareth, and they brought the child Jesus to the temple for his bar mitzvah at 12, and they lost him for 3 days. I'm sure any parent who has ever lost a child for even a few seconds, a few minutes, knows the terror, the horror she must have experienced for 3 days looking for Jesus. And finally finding him in the temple teaching the wise men of Israel and saying he had to be about his Father's work. And when he went forth in his public ministry and ending his days being arrested and charged with all kinds of crimes by his enemies, sentenced to death, and there Mary had to see that beloved child of hers carrying the cross on the way to Calvary. I always remember the scene in that movie, the Gospel of Matthew, which showed Jesus carrying the cross and then coming to a narrow street or alley in which Mary was standing, and their eyes meet. And he said, "See, I am making all things new." And I thought, wow, that's not in the gospel. But yes, it is in Revelation. A beautiful reflection of what Jesus was doing by the mystery of the cross, making the whole old world, sinful as it is, a new world for God's kingdom. And yes, Mary had to know the horror of standing under that cross as his blood dripped on her, and then holding his dead body before burial. Yes, Mary knew in a very intense way sorrows, the passion of her son. Any parent who's had to bury a child knows what a deep wound that is, how horrible it is. So Mary shared in the sufferings of Christ in a very intimate way. And I think by the Feast of Our Lady of Sorrows, she's reminding all of us who are her children to follow her example, to be united with Jesus in the mystery of the cross. The road to glory, the road to eternal life. God bless you and all those whom you love and care for.